Yes. So talking about the Azure management infrastructure. So basically, in the end, of course, we've talked about these data centers quite a lot already. But in the end, of course, we want to deploy our solution. We want to maybe deploy some analytics infrastructure. Like maybe I want to build a data lake and I need a storage account or SQL Server or Databricks, or maybe I want to host a website and then I need, total different amount of resources. But in the end, our goal, of course, is always going to be to get that infrastructure up and running for us so that we can get our solution off the ground. But in order to get that done, Azure, Gregor, I can see your screen. Yes, thank you. So in order to get that running, Azure helps us basically to group our resources in a logical way. So we're going to go through all of these different definitions in a bit, but I wanted to show you the hierarchy first so that you had that in mind and so that you could kind of, get let's say an umbrella to hang, the information on. So basically on the top level, we have management groups, and management groups can be a logical grouping of subscriptions. And then when we talk about subscriptions, they hold resource groups. And then lastly, the resource groups, they can hold one to multiple resources. And that is just how Azure does it. So it's good to know what these things are when you see them on the internet. So let's go through them real quick. Can we go on further, Gregor?
Yeah, let me just change something. Let me just move this up here so I can move it. Oh, hang on. Sorry, I'm making a mess of this. Hang on.
No worries. I
Go...
just thought you weren't aware of the fact that you were still sharing the screen.
No, it's not good. Go
okay,
for it.
I might as well tell you real quick before anything happens. All right. So on the lowest part of our hierarchy, of course, we have our resources, right? These resources make up our solution. So if I want to build an analytics platform, maybe I'm going to go with Databricks or Synapse Analytics or something like that. So they are the fundamental building blocks of our Azure infrastructure. I just put all of the different icons here in a heart to show, this is the heart of our infrastructure. Well, these are the services and components that are offered to us by Azure. So if we go into the portal, there we can really see the big range of resources that are available to us. But just to give you some examples, it can be a storage account, SQL Server, web apps, virtual machines, AKS, Azure Functions, and basically anything you can think of. And we will also see some of these resources here today. So yeah, basically each resource is created and managed as an independent entity, and it has its own set of properties, configurations, and access controls. For example, if you talk about storage accounts, you can deploy that into different regions, and then you can say, okay, I want to encrypt the infrastructure or not, and I want to have maybe more hot access tier for data that I often access, or maybe more cool for archive storage, etc., etc. And all of these different resources have their own specific special configurations that you can set. All right, Gregor, can we go on further, please? So when we talk about resource groups are there so that we can group all of these resources, right? Think about it. Let's say we are a very big company and we have many different solutions that we want to host on Azure. Would it really be so nice if we had all of these resources just, sitting in the Azure portal? Like, it wouldn't be that easy to really find the resources we were looking for, right? So what we would usually see companies do is they group these resources into resource groups based on usually a logical thing. So let's say that we have different types of solutions. Maybe I want to host a website, and there's also a backend to that, like with the database and stuff. So then the data part we can group into one resource group, and then the resources that we need for our web application we can host in the other resource group. And then we kind of have a logical grouping of these two things, and it's more easy for us to find really, the resources that we're looking for. It's not only just for the sake of simplicity and just it being handy, but it's also so that we can, apply consistent policies. So maybe for our website side of things, we only want it to be deployed in the West Europe region. in that case, what we can do is we can set a policy on that resource group to ensure that all of the resources there are only going to be, deployed in the West Europe region, which is pretty cool. And when we think about consistent permissions, we don't want, let's say, the data people to access the web application side of things and vice versa. So the resource groups also allow us to have like consistent permissions and to give people the right amount of access. And if we don't have resource groups, then we need to do that on all of the resources independently, which is quite cumbersome. So in that regard, it's easy and nice to, have these resource groups as well. When you think about cost management, just the fact that we can group all of these resources, that is really handy for, billing purposes, because in that regard, we can kind of already see, hey, the web application side of things is costing us this much per month, and the database side of things is usually a bit more expensive, let's be honest. That's costing us this much. And then you can really start thinking, okay, maybe I need to do some more cost management on the database side of things. Maybe I need to tweak it a bit more. And in effect, of course, that also simplifies our billing. Gregor, can we move one slide further? So, I always start thinking, what does this mean? So in essence, when we think about resources, resources are always deployed in a resource group. So when we start in the Azure portal, but it doesn't really matter if we deploy, our resources using the portal or the CLI or PowerShell or whatnot, whatever we like, a resource will always have this setting for a resource group. And if we don't have a resource group, then we have to create it, right? But these resource groups, they can hold multiple resources. That's kind of their purpose. If that wouldn't be possible, that would kind of defeat the purpose of grouping things together. But the other thing, the other side of things, that's not true. So when we talk about resources, they cannot be, deployed into multiple resource groups. So a resource group can hold multiple resources, but one resource cannot be in multiple resource groups. So that's good to know. And resource groups cannot hold resource groups. So it's not like a nested situation. So they kind of thought about the management groups, the subscriptions, and the resource groups, but we cannot really go anything further than that. So we cannot have a resource group in a resource group in a resource group. Maybe some people would find that a pity. I think that would also be maybe a organizational nightmare, but this is the limitations that we have to deal with. All right, can we go on further? Yes. So one further up the hierarchy, we have our subscriptions, right? So a subscription is something that you make when you start creating your account in the Azure portal. They provide us the access to the Azure resources, or to creating Azure resources, I should say. So how you are paying, that is basically decided upon, that subscription level. So if you create a subscription, depending on the type of subscription that you have, usually you put in your credit card number and, Microsoft knows how to reach you. A subscription itself also has a unique identifier. I think a resource group in that regard also kind of has, a name and therefore also a unique identifier in that regard. As I mentioned, the billing is done on a subscription level, but there are different types of subscriptions. I named the three, I would say, most popular ones. So when you start off with creating a new Azure account, then you can get like a free subscription, but that is not free forever. So it's usually free for like, I would say 12 months. And then you get like $200 worth of credits to try out some Azure resources. And then there are some other resources that are always free, but I don't know that by heart, to be honest. If you want to continue to run Azure after that free period, of course, you already filled in your credit card. So then, if you put it to the pay-as-you-go kind of subscription, then they will start billing you for the resources that you're using. And I would say for us mortals, so to speak, so if we personally were to create an Azure account and get an Azure subscription, most likely we would have that pay-as-you-go model. So we put in our credit card details, and then Microsoft knows where to reach us at the end of the month. So we pay for the resources that we use. Of course, for big companies, that is not really feasible, right? So if we think about it, companies might have hundreds of subscriptions for different teams, and just to have billing per credit card for all of these things, that's just not doable. So in that case, you get more like enterprise agreement kind of things. So it's a little bit more complex, and then you get, you know, your big bill at the end of the month, but it's not so necessarily to that credit card. All right, I do see one question coming in. A customer has resources that are used by different resources located. Would it be okay to place the commonly used resources in a resource group that can be accessed by these, or would you rather not share these and have this service per resource group, even if it is redundant? Oh, okay. So you're basically saying there are some resources that are accessed by, you know, multiple teams, let's say. And in this case, you're naming something like log analytics. So yeah, what I would personally do for customers that have resources that are shared over resource groups is sometimes I would, you know, I would make like a specific resource group for that. For example, let's say you have one application, right? So you have that web application together with that database or more analytical platform, and you want these two, you know, types of solutions to point to the same log analytics workspace, which can be good because it's about the same kind of solution. In that regard, I would say, okay, well, in that case, it's okay to have maybe a different resource group and put one log analytics workspace into that. But of course, I wouldn't overdo it. So I wouldn't have maybe one log analytics workspace for the entire company. But it really depends from use case to use case. I would say it's more important about, you know, grouping these resources into resource groups and even subscriptions that are handy for your use case. So it has to make sense to you. But what I usually see companies doing is they create like a subscription for dev, test, and production. That also helps with giving, you know, people the correct rights. So dev and test people can get access to dev and test subscriptions, and then, you know, maybe database administrators or administrators in general can get access to the production. And then more the resource groups are grouped into logical things for the solution. So the web app and the database and stuff like that. So that's how I usually see it being done. But I don't know, Gregor, do you have different experience?
Yeah, so I think what Carl's probably suggesting is you might have resource groups for a project. You might have 2 or 3 resource groups, and potentially have a shared resource group where you might use Key Vault. So that's the kind of idea. You could make use of like a Key Vault across 3 or 4, or like one project, but you could separate the project resources into different resource groups. For example, you might have like RG-networking where you put your networking, RG apps where you put your web apps, and then maybe RG shared where you would put things like Key Vault and log analytics and things like that are kind of shared resources across all other resources. So that's what I would say for that. It's usually a good idea to do things like that.
Yeah.
It's like the hub and spoke model. They have this hub and spoke model where you have like the hub where you put the shared resources in the hub, and then the spoke is basically just like an individual different customers, for example, could make reference to that. So you have like the hub and spoke model where you would have the Key Vault would be in the hub and all the different spokes would share that Key Vault. So that's an example of that, I guess.
Okay.
Good question,
That
though.
makes sense. Yeah, very good. I hope that answered your question, Carl. If we can go one further for now. So on the top of our hierarchy, we have the management groups. So basically how, you know, we had subscriptions that can hold multiple resource groups that can hold multiple resources. Management groups basically hold multiple subscriptions. So to be frank, you know, in my experience, I haven't seen many customers actually doing this. I think this is only a good idea if you're a really big company. But management groups in essence are considered containers for subscriptions, and they can even hold other management groups. So if we want to have, for like, let's say we are a very big company. So, you know, I work for a very big, large bank, and they might have not even several teams, but several departments using the Azure cloud. Well, in that case, it might be nice to have a management group per department so that we can group all of the subscriptions that are used by all of these teams, into that one management group, so that we can really easily see, okay, well, this department is spending that and this department is spending that, for example. So in that case, I would say management groups could be quite nice for you because, well, they offer us with centralized management. They can help with simplifying governments even more, having that consistent security. But all of these things also apply to subscriptions and resource groups already. So that's why I think, we see less customers actually using this. But the bigger your company gets and the more teams you have, I think the nicer it becomes to implement these things. I don't know about you, Simon and Matt, but did you guys ever have a customer that wanted to have management groups?
Not yet. We've seen people, as you've said, use different subscriptions, and then they limit stuff through using resource tags and Azure policy. But no, I've not come across any customers yet that we support using management groups.
Okay. Yeah,
I've had a couple, but yeah, sort of it's when you've got a large array of kind of complexity, and sort of you need that extra control. That kind of, like you said, if you could nest resource groups or something similar, then you might go down that route. But the management groups just give you that extra control that's sometimes needed.
And would you say that it's usually like big companies that do that, or are there also like smaller companies that want to do that?
It's generally the bigger companies because they're the ones with the more kind of complex compliancy and kind of governance requirements that management groups help you with.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So yeah, if we could go to, I think, my last slide already. Or one to less, I think. Yeah. So basically, to drive the point home, does a subscription always need a management group? Well, the answer is no. So even though, our resources always needed a resource group and our resource groups always needed a subscription, we don't necessarily need the management groups if we don't want them. But they can be quite nice, when we are a very large company and we do have a lot of resources. All right. Then to go to the last one. So just to reiterate that, on the top of our hierarchy, we have the management groups. We don't necessarily have to deploy these management groups, but we can use them if we have a lot of resources and we need, that extra management opportunities. Then under the management groups, we have our subscriptions, and this is also where we are billed on. So this is the point where we put in our credit card number if we're an individual, or we go for more an enterprise agreement when we're a big company. Well, subscriptions hold resource groups and resource groups hold resources. So resource groups can hold multiple resources, but resources themselves cannot be deployed into multiple resource groups. And I think that's it. Thank you.